In the 1960s, a young couple carried out the most heinous crimes against children. Their names would subsequently be synonymous with evil, and they horrified the British public. My name's Emma, this is Tiki Bar True Crimes, and I'd like to tell you the case of Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. Now, I've wanted to do this case for a while now. It's probably one of the first true crime documentaries I've ever watched. I started watching true crime maybe an early teen, and the Moors Murderers was definitely one of the first ones, along probably with the Yorkshire Ripper. The Yorkshire Ripper I will do probably at some point as well. Also, if a cat suddenly randomly appears, it's our neighbour's cat that lives like 2 doors down and loves this bar, spends all day at this bar. Like, they've only just moved because I've set everything up, so they may appear, they may not. Ian Brady was born in 1938 to a single mother, Peggy Stewart. His birth name is Ian Stewart. His father is unknown. Peggy says that he was a journalist working for a local newspaper, but died 3 months before Ian was born. Peggy, being a single mother, was unable to afford childcare, but had to work. This meant that Ian was sometimes left for long hours by himself. When Ian was just 4 months old, Peggy was forced to give him up for unofficial adoption to a local couple who had 4 children of their own. Peggy would often visit Ian, her son, but never admitted to being his mother, never told him that she was his mother. This must have been very hard for her. Ian was a very lonely child, a very difficult child. Some reports say that he often tortured animals, which he later denied. He didn't have many friends, and at the age of 10 years old, he apparently boasted about killing his first cat. He then went on to burn another cat alive, stone dogs, and cut the heads off of rabbits. He had a real fascination with the Nazis and their ideology, and as an early teen he started to dabble in petty crime like theft, and this escalated to burglary. At around 15 years old, Brady actually gets a girlfriend, Evelyn Grant. This relationship didn't last long when he threatened her with a knife after she visited a dance with another boy. Due to all this criminal activity, Brady ends up in court faced with 9 charges. He gets probation and is ordered to go and live with his biological mother in order to avoid custodial sentence. I'm not sure at what point he knows that Peggy is his biological mother. I imagine when he found out that was quite hard because it's a complete change to what he already knew. So at the age of 16 or 17, Ian now moves back in with his mother, Peggy. She is married to a Patrick Brady, and in order to kind of cement his relationship within this new family, he takes on Patrick's surname and becomes Ian Brady. His fascination with the Nazis and other sadistic ideology continued, along with his criminal activity. This led him to be imprisoned in Strangeways. Strangeways is based in Manchester, and it's a high security prison. It was a very rude awakening for Ian. This place imprisoned serial killers, rapists, the worst kind of criminals. It executed people up until the 60s. Whilst he was there and on release, Brady really knuckled down and actually studied bookkeeping. After he was released in 1957, 2 years later, he landed a job as a clerk. Aged 21, he was regarded by his colleagues as quiet, punctual, but very short-tempered. A couple of years later, in 1961, this is where he would meet Myra when she is hired as a secretary. Myra Hindley was born in 1948 to her parents Bob and Nellie. Her father was an alcoholic and would have violent outbursts towards his wife and children, including Myra herself. They were a very poor family, and Myra had to sleep in a single bed next to her parents. Their living situation deteriorated even more when Myra's younger sister Maureen was born. Finances were stretched considerably, and Myra ended up having to live with her grandmother. Myra's father was known locally as a hard man. He had been in the army and he expected his children to be tough as well. On one occasion, Myra came home in absolute tears after a boy scratched her cheek, drawing blood. Her father, rather than comforting her, said he would leather her if she didn't retaliate. Myra then went out, found the boy and gave him several punches, knocking him out. She later wrote in her diary that at 8 years old she'd scored her first victory. A psychiatrist would later say that Hindley's relationship with her father brutalised her. She was not only used to violence in the home, but actually rewarded for it. When this happens at a young age, it can distort a person's reaction to such situations for life. When Myra was 15 years old, one of her very close friends, a 13-year-old boy called Michael Higgins, invited her down to the reservoir for a local swim. She didn't take him up on the offer and instead went out with another friend. Michael ended up drowning in that reservoir and hit Myra really hard. She was a very good swimmer and believed that if she had been there, Michael would have survived. She ended up going around the local community to collect money for a wreath for his funeral. In Myra's first ever job, she was a junior clerk and she was well liked. She would run errands, fetch coffee, and she was very popular, to the point that when she lost her first week's wage package, all the girls had a sort of whip round and got the money for her. In 1961, at the age of 18, Myra got a job as a typist at the same company that Ian Brady worked at. She instantly was fascinated by him and was in absolute awe. He was very charismatic. At first, they didn't really talk that much, and Myra would write in her diary all these things about him, including like delusions and stories she would make up. Eventually though, Brady asked her out on a date and they went to the cinema. Their dates would go something like this. They would go and watch an X-rated movie and then they would go back to Hindley's house, which she shared with her grandmother, and drink and read aloud Nazi ideology. Hindley became obsessed with this idea of an Aryan race and she bleached her hair and started wearing bright red crimson lipstick. She was completely persuaded by Brady, and even to the point where he would do odd, bizarre things to her, but just kind of brush it off. She once told a friend that he drugged her. Years later, when she goes to apply for parole, she says that Brady is very manipulative, very persuasive. Despite being a staunch Catholic, Brady convinces her that there is no God. She says that he could have told her that the world was flat, that the moon was made of cheese, and she would have believed him. Before meeting Brady, Hindley was quite prudish. She was a Catholic and she liked things in certain orders. However, after meeting and dating Brady for a while, her appearance starts to change. She starts wearing thigh-high boots, short skirts, and has a more sexier appearance. This is in order to appease Brady and his needs. So Brady has changed Hindley's looks, he's changed her ideology, and he now wants to see how far he can push this. He suggests that they rob a bank, and Hindley is all for it. She even manages to obtain a gun from the local rifle club. This plan, however, kind of fizzles away, but more importantly, Brady has someone that will go along with his plans, that will help him make his perverted criminal fantasies reality. So he starts up this new fascination with photography and ends up convincing Hindley to take explicit photos of herself. This is a far cry from the prudish Catholic girl that he met. Hindley's family also notice a dramatic change in her. She's moody, she doesn't really socialise with her friends anymore, and is very, very secretive. Brady manages to convince Hindley that murder and rape are the supreme pleasures of life. So in June 1963, they go looking for their first victim. Hindley has hired a van and following her is Brady on a motorbike. They are out in the early evening driving around town. When Brady sees a victim that he likes, he will flash his lights giving Hindley the signal to pull over and convince that child to get into the van. They're driving around and they spot an 8-year-old girl. Brady flashes his lights, but Myra carries on driving. Brady revs up the engine, pulls up right beside Hindley to say, "What's going on? Why didn't you get that little girl?" Myra says that she knows that girl, that's a neighbour, and she thinks that kidnapping such a young child is going to draw far more attention early on than if they go with someone older. That little girl was called Marie Ruck. They carry on and Brady spots 16-year-old Pauline Reed. He gives Myra the signal and she pulls over. She actually knows Pauline, as that was a classmate of her younger sister Maureen. After making small talk, Myra realises that Pauline is on her way to a local dance. She offers her a lift and Pauline gets in. Once in the van, Myra says could they go to Saddleworth Moor, as she lost a very expensive glove up there and would like some help looking for it. Pauline agrees, thinking nothing of it, and off they head. Once they arrive, it's dark and Brady pulls up on his motorbike. Pauline was very happy to help, so off she went with Brady onto the moor. 30 minutes later, he returned to the van where Myra was waiting. They walked up to where Pauline was and she lay there dying. Her throat has been slit with knives and it was nearly decapitated. Her clothes were in disarray and Brady admitted that he'd SA'd her. Later, Brady would state that although Hindley didn't murder Pauline, she did participate in the SA. He then grabbed a spade, which he had hidden on the moor in preparation for this, dug a shallow grave and put Pauline's lifeless body in there. They walked back to the van, loaded up the motorbike and drove back into town. On their way back, they saw Pauline's mother and her son frantically looking for her. A few months later, 12-year-old John Kilbride is at a market. It's getting late and he's worried that his parents are going to get angry if he's not home soon. Myra spots him and offers him a lift home. He gets into the car with Hindley and Brady. Brady said they need to make a detour in order to get that promised bottle of sherry. He then suggests they go up to the moor to find Myra's missing glove. They head up there, and whilst Myra waits in the car, Brady and John head off onto the moor looking for this glove. Brady then viciously attacked this 12-year-old boy, John. He SA'd him. He attempted to slice his throat with a serrated blade, but that didn't work. The pain, anguish and fear this little boy must have gone through is just too much. As that wasn't working, he grabbed either his own shoelace or a piece of string and strangled John to death. He then dug a shallow grave and placed John in there. He went back to the car to get Myra. Myra came with her pet dog and proceeded to stand on top of this grave whilst Brady took her photo in some macabre trophy-like way. She stood on top of this disturbed ground with John's lifeless body, not even cold, meters under her feet, posing for a photo with her dog. When the alarm was raised, a huge search was undertaken with 700 statements, 500 missing posters. After 8 days with no leads or nothing, 2,000 volunteers searched derelict buildings, just everywhere, trying to look for this little boy. But nothing. It's like he vanished into thin air. 6 months later, in June 1964, Keith Bennett had just celebrated his 12th birthday 4 days earlier. He was walking from his parents to his grandmother's house when Hindley pulled over. She asked if he could help loading some boxes into the van. Keith Bennett was happy to help. He was a very kind boy. Hindley said that for his help, for being such a good boy, she would then drive him home. Once in the van, Brady suggested going up to the moor to look for this missing glove. Once there, Brady and Keith Bennett got out and Myra once again stayed in the vehicle. 30 minutes later, Brady returned. He had essayed Keith and buried him on the moor. For 2 years after Keith's disappearance, the prime suspect was his stepfather, Jimmy Johnson. Jimmy was brought in for questioning on 4 separate occasions. They even dug up the floorboards of the family home, and where they lived in a terrace and realised it was all connected, they dug up the entire street under all the houses, searching for Keith. They really thought his stepfather, Jimmy, had done something to him. To this day, and to the heartbreak of his family, Keith Bennett's body has never been discovered. In 1964, Brady Hindley, along with Hindley's grandmother, are actually relocated to a different house down Wardlebrook Avenue. On Boxing Day, Hindley convinces her grandmother to go to a relative's house and says that she's not allowed back until the following day. That evening, Brady and Hindley attend a fun fair looking for their next victim. This place is full of happy children having fun after probably a magical Christmas day. They spot 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. She's standing alone, so the couple take that opportunity. They go up to her and pretend to drop some of their shopping, being clumsy. Leslie offers to help them and even takes it back to their car. She even says that she'd help them take it from their car to their house, so she gets in and they head back to Wardlebrook Avenue. 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey enters Brady and Hindley's home and is immediately attacked. She's undressed, gagged, and forced to take explicit photos. This attack was actually recorded on an audio tape and later played to Leslie's mother. You can hear Leslie screaming and pleading for help. She calls for her mother on multiple occasions. This must have been a horrific thing to listen to as a mother, knowing that your 10-year-old girl's last moments of life was so terrifying. Brady and Hindley murder Leslie Ann Downey. They end up blaming each other for this murder. Neither admits to it. Leslie's naked, lifeless body remains in their home overnight. They then, in the morning, load her into the car and bury her in a shallow grave, placing her clothes at her feet. All throughout that night, Leslie's mother is stricken with panic and fear, searching for Leslie all over this fun fair and subsequently all over town. Despite a huge search, Leslie wasn't found at the time. Again, it's the stepfather who is the prime suspect. Alan West, Leslie's stepfather, is questioned repeatedly, although no evidence ever appears, and her disappearance remained unsolved for over a year. Nearly 1 year later, in October 1965, Brady and Hindley are on the search for their next victim. They end up at Manchester Central Station. Brady has a fascination with railway stations and he goes in and spots Edward Evans. 17-year-old Edward Evans is an apprentice and he also knows Brady. They have seen each other a couple of times down the local pub. They catch each other's eye and make some small talk. It's believed that Brady possibly fancied Edward, wanted a sexual encounter with him. Brady convinces Edward to come back with him, and when they get in the car, he introduces Hindley as his sister. They drive back to Brady and Hindley's home and relax in the front room having a bottle of wine. At some point during the evening, Brady convinces Hindley to go and get her 17-year-old brother-in-law, David Smith. He is married to her sister Maureen. He's not particularly liked in the family. He has a lot of past convictions. He's known as a bit of a hard man, a bit tough. But David Smith and Ian Brady get on really well. David has this kind of fascination with Brady, and Brady again is kind of in awe of David. There's speculation that perhaps he fancied him. He's a 17-year-old boy, very similar to his other victims. David Smith and Maureen, Myra's sister, had a little baby girl called Angela. She had passed away at 6 months old due to cot death. David also had a really hard time trying to hold down a job. So this family is under intense emotional and financial stress at the minute. Brady offers to help David. He says he'll call on him one night and he'll give him the code that he's going to come over and pick up some wine. When he comes over, Brady's going to take him into town where they're going to attack a homosexual and rob him. This will solve financial troubles. So Myra goes to her sister's house, calls on David and says, "Are you going to come over and get these bottles of wine?" He comes over and waits in the kitchen, thinking that he's going to go with Brady into town and attack a homosexual to get some money. However, that's not what happens. And this is the statement he gave. "I waited about a minute or two, then suddenly I heard a hell of a scream. It sounded like a woman, really high-pitched. Then the screams carried on, one after another, really loud. Then I heard Myra shout, 'Dave, help him,' very loud. When I ran in, I just stood inside the living room and I saw a young lad. He was lying with his head and shoulders on the couch and his legs were on the floor. He was facing upwards. Ian was standing over him, facing him, with his legs on either side of the young lad's legs. The lad was still screaming. Ian had a hatchet in his hand. He was holding it above his head and he hit the lad on the left side of his head with the hatchet. I heard the blow. It was a terrible, hard blow. It sounded horrible." Smith looked on in horror as Brady throttled Evans. This wasn't an easy attack, and Edward wasn't going down without a fight. Brady sprained his ankle in the struggle. Edward Evans passed away at the hands of Brady in front of David Smith, who looked on in complete shock. Edward's body was too heavy for them to take to the car, so David promised that in the morning that he would bring over his dead baby girl's pram so that they can transport the body from the house to the car. David went home, and this was around 3 a.m. His wife Maureen made him a cup of tea, and he subsequently just threw up everywhere. His wife Maureen is like, "What the hell's going on?" Like, she can tell he's really shook up, like something's happened. So he just breaks down and tells her everything. At 6 a.m, David leaves his house with a screwdriver and a knife because he is in complete fear of Brady. He's seen what he can do. He goes straight to a phone box and calls the police and tells them everything. Police immediately go and collect David and bring him in. So when they hear this story, detectives decide that they need to go to Brady's house. A police officer dresses up as a bread delivery guy. He goes round the back of the house and bumps into Myra. He asks whether her husband's home, which she denies. She actually denies that any man lives in that house at all. At this point, the police officer reveals who he is and Myra leads him into the living room, where Brady is just kind of lying on the couch, contacting his employer saying, "Sorry, I can't come in today, I've sprained my ankle." The police ask to search the home. They say they fear there's been some gun crime in the area and would like to have a little look around. They begin to search and come across a guest bedroom that's locked. Myra says she can't open it because she left the key at work. After the police offer to drive her to work to get that key, Brady says, "Oh, just let them in." They open the door and there is Edward Evans' lifeless body laying on the bed. When they turn to Brady, he just remarks, "Oh, Eddie and I had a little bit of a disagreement that got out of hand." Brady is immediately arrested and brought in for questioning. Hindley, however, isn't, and she remains a free woman for 4 days. Brady goes on to tell this story how it was him and David Smith. It had nothing to do with Hindley. However, when they begin to investigate further, they search Hindley's car and find a note with a detailed description and plan of how they're going to commit this murder. So they bring Hindley in for questioning as well. They search the couple's home and end up finding an exercise book with John Kilbride's name on it, the 12-year-old boy who went missing. This blows the case wide open and the police begin to think that this couple may be responsible for all these missing children. So during the search of Myra and Hindley's home, they find Hindley's prayer book and in it contains a ticket for a left luggage at the central station. So they went there, retrieved this case, and found various items, including costumes and 9 pornographic photos of the young Leslie Ann Downey, including that 16-minute audio tape. So through a couple of the photos and the audio tape where Leslie is screaming and pleading for her life, they are able to confirm that she is one of Hindley and Brady's victims. Other photos in this case that they open include pictures of the moors, which they believe are locations where they buried their victims. Now, the moor is a vast area, so the police ask locals to help them identify these places. Officers also spoke to a very young girl, Patricia Hodges, who was actually Brady's and Hindley's neighbour. She would often accompany them to the moors to collect peat for their gardens. This was a very common thing for people to do. Brady and Hindley never hurt her. They said it was far too close to home. They questioned Patricia and she was able to take them to some of Brady and Hindley's favourite places. So through the help of locals, as well as Patricia, the police were able to identify the locations in those places. They immediately start searching the area, and on the 16th of October, they find an arm protruding from the peat. Initially, they think it's the young boy John Kilbride, but very quickly realise it's actually Leslie Ann Downey. 5 days later, they find the badly decomposed body of John. His mother had to identify him through his clothing. Believing that Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett are 2 more suspects that are buried on the moors, police continue searching. However, it's getting harder. We're moving into winter and the landscape is difficult to navigate and just harder to search. The search ends up being called off. In December, Brady is charged with the murder of John Kilbride, Leslie Ann Downey and Edward Evans. Hindley is charged with the murder of Leslie and Edward and the accessory to murder for John. Even after all the photographs and the audio tapes, they are still denying any involvement in Leslie Ann Downey's murder. They're stating that she did come to their house, that they did take those pictures, but she left, and they are also trying to accuse David Smith of murdering her. Many of those pictures that they get from that case that are of the moor and possible locations of where their victims are buried feature Myra's dog. In order to ascertain the timeline, they give these pictures to a veterinary surgeon. He wants to examine the dog to ascertain its age and has to put it under general anaesthetic. In doing so, the dog dies. This is the only time that Myra shows real anguish and remorse, not for any of her victims or the torture that they put them through, but for her dog. She says, "I feel as though my heart's been torn to pieces. I don't think anything could hurt me more than this. The only consolation is that some moron might have got hold of Puppet," which is her dog's name, "and hurt him." Brady as well never showed any remorse for any of his victims or what he did, to the public's revulsion. And I think this is what makes them so notorious and evil. They just didn't care. They didn't care for what they did. They showed absolutely no remorse, no regret, no empathy towards any of their victims, who were children. The trial begins, and because they are so hated in the UK, bulletproof glass has to be installed in the dock. They genuinely believe that someone is going to try and kill these two in just broad daylight in a courtroom. Both Brady and Hindley enter pleas of not guilty. They were both found guilty, with Brady given 3 concurrent life sentences and Hindley 2. The judge described Brady as wicked beyond belief. He said he saw no possibility for reform and he definitely shouldn't be allowed parole. He didn't think the same was true for Hindley once Hindley had been removed from Brady's influence. In 1987, so this is 20 years after the trial, Hindley actually admits to all 5 murders, including Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. On hearing that Hindley had admitted to these murders, Brady also admitted to them. Hindley did help with the search to find Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. With her help, they narrowed their search to a specific location and ended up finding the body of Pauline just 100 yards away from where Leslie Ann Downey's body was found. Brady also visited the moors, but just wasn't helpful at all. He lost his bearings. He said that the terrain was completely different. Various searches have been performed over the years, but Keith Bennett's body was never found. And on the 7th of October 2022, the police stated that they have called off the searches. When he was imprisoned, Brady immediately said that he wanted to stay in solitary confinement, I assume because he was afraid of the other inmates. He was officially diagnosed as a psychopath, and it was decided that he would never be released. In the late 90s, Brady is now in a psychiatric institution, and he says that he wants to starve himself to death. He states that he has the right. He doesn't want to live out his life sentence. He wants to die. He wants the ability to take his own life. This goes to the High Court, which say that he's not allowed to do that, and that the hospital has a right to force feed him, which they do. Hindley and Brady's relationship quickly deteriorated. Within 5 years of being incarcerated, they no longer wrote letters to each other, and the relationship ended. Brady died in 2017. He was cremated without a ceremony, and his ashes were disposed of at sea at night. During the 1990s, Hindley claimed that she took part in the killings only because Brady had drugged her. He was blackmailing her with pornographic pictures and had threatened to kill Maureen, her sister. In 2008, Hindley's solicitor said that Myra told him, "I ought to have been hanged. I deserved it. My crime was worse than Brady's because I enticed the children and they would never have entered the car without my role. I have always regarded myself as worse than Brady." And I think this is why sometimes Hindley is seen as more evil than Brady, because she used her female identity to lure children. Children naturally see a woman and feel safe, and she used that. Even though she wasn't a mother herself, she used that kind of mothering aura to get these children into the car. Would these children have got into a car with just a man? Possibly not. But if you see a woman, you suddenly kind of feel safe, especially back then in the 60s when it was kind of not really as heard of for a woman to murder, particularly murder children. Whilst in prison, Hindley fell in love with one of the prison warders, Patricia Cairns. With the help of Patricia, she tried to escape. This escape plan was thwarted, and Cairns ended up serving 6 years in jail for her part. In 2002, Hindley, who was a notorious chain smoker, died from pneumonia. So this is 55 years after the murders, and she is hated that much that 20 local undertakers refused to handle her cremation. She was cremated, and her ex-partner Patricia Cairns, who tried to help her escape, scattered her ashes just 10 miles from Saddleworth Moor. I don't particularly think that's very respectful. Really, it probably should have been done at sea, like Brady. But there we go. So this case affected many people, including David Smith, Myra's brother-in-law. He was reviled by the people of Manchester because he actually financially profited from the case. He sold his story to a local paper. Maureen, his wife, was attacked. She was 8 months pregnant at the time. Their flat was vandalised, and Maureen said she would never let her children out of their sight for fear that they would be harmed. David Smith actually ends up in prison after stabbing a man. He said that the attack was triggered by the abuse he got from this trial. Maureen received no help from her family. She was viciously attacked by neighbours and forced to move out of their flat. Their children were taken into the care of the local authority. Maureen didn't receive any help from her family, but Myra's mother, so Maureen's mother, supported her throughout the whole trial, but didn't support Maureen afterwards. Despite the fact that Maureen had nothing to do with any of this, her life is turned completely upside down. She is exiled out of her home. Her children are tormented. She is tormented when she's heavily pregnant. She divorces David Smith and eventually does rebuild a relationship with her mother. Maureen and her mother did make regular visits to see Hindley in prison. Maureen suffered a brain hemorrhage in 1980 and Hindley was allowed to visit her at the hospital, but was too late. She had died 1 hour before Myra arrived. At Maureen's funeral, the parents of John Kilbride turned up, hoping that Myra would be there. Sheila, the mother, said that if Myra ever got out, she'd kill her. Myra didn't turn up to her sister's funeral, so John Kilbride's parents were left disappointed. Leslie Ann Downey's mother died of cancer in the late 90s. She repeatedly appealed for Myra to be kept in prison. Myra had parole many times, but was never released. The doctors say that the stress of this and the case made her illness much more severe. Keith Bennett's mother, the little boy that was never found, continued to visit Saddleworth Moor, thinking that he was there somewhere. She later died in the early 2000s, never knowing where her son was or being able to lay him to rest. City Council decided to demolish Brady and Hindley's home as it just got way too much attention, excessive media attention, which was unpleasant for the residents that lived down their street, so it was demolished. This couple have lasting notoriety and their pictures are infamous for evil. That was the case of the Moors murderers. I hope you enjoyed that case. It was a long one, I think. This is probably the longest one I've ever done. I tried to include as much information as possible. If you can, give it a like, a comment or a subscribe. I would be very, very grateful. If you have any suggestions for ones that I should do, I think I am going to do the Yorkshire Ripper one next. It might be a longer one as well. But yeah, let me know. And I will see you in the next one.